Last time, greatly helped by having the three wonderful talks before me, because I can pick up some of the points and run off those too. So I want to start with this idea that narrative is so important and so central to the sense of self, to perhaps our notion of memory, to consciousness having any kind of enduring patterns or the ability to think about the future, or even narrative and language being one of the ways in which we make sure we're not trapped within our own consciousness and we can actually communicate with others. Because I think that is a powerful grip on us, but I think all of those views are slightly false and have to be tempered, otherwise things that we are unaware of will get soon forgotten in much the way that I think Sam was talking about and Dottie was talking about too. So, if we go back for a moment, there's something interesting about the fact that most of you do not have memories before the age of 2. If you think you do, it's probably because somebody told you what happened to you when you were in your pram or when you were so young, and you've sort of internalized that and got used to telling people about it, and you've now owned it as though you were really there in the experience. You probably were not. And childhood amnesia is quite difficult to understand. Why don't we remember anything for the age of 2? A lot was happening to us. We were changing shape, we were growing, we were learning a lot. And one reason is we don't have language, because it's right about the age of 20 months to 24 months that you will have not just one word, 2 words, but you'll have syntax, and you put things together and you'll now be able to form whole sentences. So perhaps without language, we don't have memory. So maybe that's going to tell us something about the role of memory in narrating our lives, narrating our experience, maybe keeping track of our stories, and indeed our histories. And stories are important, because when tomorrow somebody asks you, how was your day yesterday, you won't give them the random chaotic set of events and moments that happened one after another. That would be boring. What you'll do is you'll package it up beautifully. Wow, the morning started well. And then, I did this and did that. You'll never guess what happened. And then in the evening, I went to talk. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you will have tidied it up. And that will make it easier to remember, but it'll also have left out a lot of the things that were the real scaffolding of helping you get through the day, know about yourself, and make contact with others. And the other thing about narrative, not only can it mislead and lasso parts of your experience into that tidy and convenient form, but you also wonder, if narrative was actually the start of self-consciousness or self-awareness, where are the materials we get to use to tell the narrative? Where do they come from? Well, we've got plenty to choose from. So we have the senses, not 5, because if we talk to contemporary neuroscientists, they'll say we have anywhere between 22 and 33 senses. 5 is bizarre. Why do we think we've only got 5 senses? We've got a sense of balance, that's very important. If that gets switched off, you will not be able to stay comfortably where you are just now. You'll probably start to feel very nauseous. So we've got many, many more senses than that. And yet, it's sort of interesting. I think it's because the Greeks told us, Aristotle told us we had 5 senses. And although we've given up his idea there are only 5 elements that make up the whole of the world, we're sort of holding on to it. And the Greeks misled us again in the way that Servus was so proud of when they told us we are just our brains. I think we're not just our brains, but I think it's interesting that people who are very wedded to the narrative theory of mind or self like to talk about us being our brains, because this is the very cerebral idea that all the inputs are happening in the brain, and that's where we'll go from. Now, we explore, in the set of the study of the senses, we explore the number of different senses you have, the way they're working. And the crucial thing to notice is that your senses massively interact with each other. They don't come in separate packages. You don't see, and then hear, and then feel, and then smell. Right now, you're hearing my voice, you're looking at me or the screen. You might even have a taste in your mouth if you've been eating or drinking something before. You can smell the perfume of your neighbour. All of that seems to take place in one seamless experience. And yet, we get very visiocentric, and it's interesting that when Sam wanted to give himself what he called sensory deprivation, he turns off sight, as if our visiocentric world is the world that's really the most important, or the only thing that's going on in our sensory lives. And of course, I'm delighted at the end of his talk as he reminded us that he was much more in touch with and tuned back into his other senses because they are there and they're working, and they're even affecting his vision, but he doesn't know that. If you want to know how other senses are affecting your vision, just try this. Next time you're on an aircraft and you're strapped in, you sit and you look along the cabin at the front, and somebody's talking to you, saying two at the front, two at the rear, and all the rest. Now look again back along the cabin when you're in the climb, and it will now look to you as though the front of the cabin is higher than you are. How can it look higher? You're in exactly the same visual relationship, optically, to the cabin you were in a moment ago. So what's happening is that your ear canals, your vestibular system, is telling you you're tilting backwards, and that's changing how you see things. So the senses affect one another. But the most important thing I want to stress here is the fact that we're not just our brains, because we're also embodied creatures. And we embody not just our emotions, but when we are affected by other people and their emotions, we also can feel that in our bodies. And if we didn't have the body reacting in these very different ways, we get pupil dilation when we're excited or perhaps aroused by someone, our blood pressure changes, there are all sorts of different neural activities as a result of what's going on in the heart. And it's not that the brain is running that, the body is sometimes running that. It's the heart rate often that's having a big effect on how you feel and how your emotions are felt, dealt with, and recognized in others moment to moment. So there's this picture of, there's everything external to me, and we're using our senses, our five senses, to figure it out, and then there's me, and that's the mind and the brain. But in fact, that's the wrong picture. We are really a body and a brain, and the body-brain, and in fact the heart-brain relationship is hugely important to how your conscious lives are led. And here I'm drawing on the work of Manos Sakiris in talking about how we've got a sense of self that's very rooted in the body, bodily ownership. Who am I? We might think, oh, I'm the self that's narrating my own consciousness with. No, I'm this body. I'm very wedded to and connected to this body. I'm very rooted in it. I feel I'm moving it. If I'm subject to brain injury or brain damage, I might feel someone else is moving my limbs and not me. And I get problems of control and agency coming in, and that will give me a very distorted sense of myself. But what's also happening is you've got this strange thing called interoception. So interoception is your senses paying attention to changes in your own body, to those butterflies in the stomach, to the quickening of the heartbeat, to the change in your respiration, the stiffening of the musculoskeletal structure when you're angry. And some people are very, very good at being aware of their interoceptive signals. They are sensitive to those changes in their bodies, and some are not. And you look and see what the consequences of that are. So here is the person who got it all going. Whenever you need a kind of founder of the best theories in modern neuroscience, you look at William James. And James said, for emotion, that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. So he thought the change in your body that you notice is the emotion. Try having anger without having any kind of stiffening, tension, any sort of rise in blood pressure, any changes in your viscera. Without those visceral propositions, you're not really feeling emotions. So there's interoception. It's about a way of sensing the internal body, its visceral organs, very different from exteroception, perceiving the world around you, but there are relations between the two. Now, you can tell whether people are any good at knowing their own bodily signals by the heartbeat test. I won't take a minute out of our time because our time is limited, but what you do is you say to people, I want you now to estimate, when I say go, how many heartbeats you've had in a minute. Are you ready? People start doing this, and no, don't touch yourself. Just be still, and just tell me, just guess how many heartbeats you've had. And of course it turns out some people are very accurate. Some people say I can't do it at all. Some people get it wildly wrong, and some people are right on the money. And the people who are seemingly good at getting that tend to have awareness of their own bodily state. They're good interoceptors. Now, James thought this was important because he said our entire feeling of spiritual activity, or what commonly passes by that name, is really a feeling of bodily activities whose exact nature is by most men overlooked. So even those heightened states where you suddenly feel you're in this wonderful state that you might get through meditation, you might get through yoga, it's a bodily state that you're paying attention to, according to James. What's happening is that, especially for heartbeat, there's going to be this important business about when your heartbeat is happening, the very rhythmic motions of the heart rate and the heartbeat. When it's actually firing, at the moment at which it's pumping out blood, your blood vessels then start to slightly increase, and you've got little receptors, baroreceptors, which measure that your blood vessels are dilating. And that signal goes to the brain, and that does an awful lot of work, baroreception. Okay, let me tell you about that. So, cardiac facilitation of fear. If we synchronize, and this is beautiful work by Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley in Sussex, absolutely wonderful work. If they time lock to the systole moment when the heart is actually pumping out the blood, if they time lock that to the presentation of a fear stimulus, people are much more afraid. If it's outside that at dystole, they're not so good at recognizing, and they might treat a neutral phase as unimportant, but at systole, when the heart rate is at its height of arousal, you will get more fear. So your heart plays a role in determining what emotions you get. Now, of course, snipers know this, for those of you who have paid attention to some of this literature, that if you can control the moment at which you take your shot to be at just the right moment of heart rhythm, you will be more accurate, you'll get a better perceptual take. And what's really interesting is the threat and the body is supported by the heart as much as it is by the brain. So subjective ratings, fear intensity judgments are different at systole at that moment when the baroreflexes are firing. You've got heightened amygdala response, right amygdala response to fear stimuli at that. All sorts of things, but the other thing I'm interested in is memory, because we thought memory was important. Beautiful paper by Garfinkel and colleagues, what the heart forgets. If you, again, ask people to remember words, if you present the words time-locked to systole, so when the heart rate is at its kind of powerful pulse, and the baroreflex is happening, you're much more able to remember words than when they're given outside of that rhythm. So even your ability to remember is going to be determined by your heart and how that affects the relationship between heart and brain. And I also want to say something to end about the idea that we think of language as being important, not just to maybe keep track of ourselves or to remember things, but we think, and we forget about the body's role in this, but not only that, we think that language is the way we go public on our consciousness. It's the way I share my thoughts and feelings with you. I literally speak my mind. By putting things into words, I get across to you. And a lot of people have this idea we're trapped within our consciousness, and language is the interface between lines. It's the way in which we reach other people. I get right through to you now by speaking. I can get right into your mind, unimpeded. I mean, it's powerful and frightening, right? I can get right in there to amuse you, upset you, insult you. I can do all of that. And you're kind of powerless to resist it because you understand what I'm saying. And so some people think that must be what socially puts us together. We become social beings because of language. But I want to remind you of how many other forms of powerful communication, social communication, empathetic communication are going on independent of language. When you look at those eyes, they grab your attention. You're kind of affected by that gaze and by that stare. And of course, you're affected by that at a very early age. At the age of 2 months, when an infant is looked at by the caregiver and the infant notices the caregiver's paying attention to them, they get skin conductance increased, their heart rate increases, they're excited and aroused, and then they get shy and they look away and they kind of cringe from it, they look back. They are powerfully affected by another person's impact on them. Mirroring we do automatically. When you like people or want to be friends with them or want to be influencing them or influenced by them, you tend automatically, you can see colleagues in the front row in a kind of similar pose, you tend to kind of automatically and without thought get into those gestures and relations. So there's a huge amount of non-communicable but intensely social and intensely important behaviour and activity. And the last thing I want to there's another little example of it, unforced. But the last thing I want to say to you is that people think there's a particularly important role for narrative and for storytelling in empathy. It's the thing that everybody in literature tells you, and I have lots and lots of colleagues who try to do research or to get grants that say, especially in the medical context, if we could just get more medics to read more literature, they would be so much more humane, they would be better, more empathetic people. I always have to remind them about the Nazi officers sort of weeping while reading their Goethe and listening to Beethoven. It's not guaranteed that because you're able to take in and understand another person's mind that you're necessarily going to be good at caring for or empathizing with them. But one reason why we think literature is important for empathy is because we think when you read another story, another life, not yours, it's opening up another person's experience, and it's an alternative version of a life that you can understand and that you expand by doing that, and you learn more about another. But literature and staying in the study and reading by yourself, I think, is not the royal road to empathy. What we know from the wonderful work of Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley is that the more you're aware interoceptively of your own bodily signals, the more you feel your emotions, and the better able you are to recognize the emotions in others, the more likely you are to have an empathetic resonance with other people. So it really is true, as the ancients said, to know thyself, because by knowing thyself, and that means the bodily self as well as the brain, you will be better placed to recognize the feelings and responses and gestures of other people. And if you're given to resonating and sometimes imitating them, you will find that will increase empathy, and that will bring you closer to them. Narrative is an extra scaffolding. It's important, but let's not forget our senses, our body, and our brain. Thank you.
I'll do my utmost to not mirror Barry now. Any questions, please? Hands up. Intimidating, as Barry was there. It's just a lady in red. I'm not wanting to say that phrase, but
Don't say it.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I would like to know why it is that an awareness of our body and our emotions contributes to happiness, do you think? And why would it be, on the flip side, that disassociation with one's body is associated with depression, sadness?
So it is all a question of balance, I think, because it's not true that just awareness of one's own body and bodily signals are guaranteed to make you happy. Too much awareness of them, if you go to the other extreme and you're dominated by your interoceptive signals, that can lead to anxiety, that can lead to a sense of heightened fear response. If you think of, and I think there's an interesting fact that when people are phobic, what they're getting is very high arousal internally that doesn't match the external signal. So I've seen somebody on an airplane beside me, and they look terrified, they're curled up, and every noise of the ailerons or every noise of the engines, and I think what's happening is their interoception is saying something very frightening, so they then try to confirm that by listening out for and trying to perceive external signals in the environment that would be proportionate to and would make it right to have that internal response. Now that's maladaptive, right? So with those people, what we have to do is damp down the internal signals. So, as Aristotle said, it's the doctrine of the mean, it's always a balance. If you're really out of touch, you are going to be probably given to not knowing your own appetites, maybe have body problems, body image problems, maybe temptation to anorexia or obesity. There's good research going on there now. But too high an interoceptive signal, at risk of anxiety, at risk of being dominated by the inside. You need a balance. You need to be in sync.
Thank you, very interesting. The idea of interoception and autism, have you investigated that?
So Sarah Garfinkel has investigated that, and you find that there are abnormal and unusual interoceptive awareness, but they're quite contradictory because in some ways you get hypersensitivity, but people haven't looked to see whether the hypersensitivity to touch or to noise, or that's exteroception. Perhaps those signals, because they're you're getting hypersensitivity, are drowning out and not allowing a corrective awareness of the interoceptive signal. That's a kind of hypothesis and suggestion, but Garfinkel and colleagues are onto that and are doing work on that.
And I just wondered, because I'd asked the question earlier about posterior cingulate cortex.
Yes.
I think there might be some interaction going on there. Do you think?
Certainly cingulate cortex, but I mean whether it's posterior or inferior, I mean there's or anterior. There's actually quite a lot of kind of trade between the two. So yes, important area, but actually a very complicated story, I think.
Hello, sir.
I just had a question just regarding when you were talking about sort of physical sensations.
Yes.
So do you think it's causing emotion or heightening emotion, or a mixture of the two?
I think it is the emotion. So here's the interesting thing, that being in a mental state is one thing, but knowing which mental state you're in is another. It takes another turn of the wheel. And so, you know, I might say to myself now, am I anxious or exhilarated? Might have almost the same bodily state. So the context will give me clues. So I think what you're doing is you're getting, the emotion is the arousal in the body, which is often in response to external stimuli. And to understand it, to know what it means, you actually have to be aware of that context. And just like the case of phobia on the plane, you've got to work out what the balance is. Was there something frightening in the environment? That's why I'm feeling fear. Now you've got them, you know, locked together. But I think it still requires you to do something. But the main story I'm trying to tell here to you is that for every moment in consciousness, how it is at that moment and what's going on depends on so many things that are going on outside of consciousness and at other times. And they are shaping and conditioning it mightily.
A round of applause for Barry Smith. Just falls to me to say thank you to Barry, Sam, Lotcher and Shrivas, and this is the third and final event I've curated for the Welcome, so a huge thanks to Emily Wiles and the Wellcome Collection for having us, and thanks to you for coming this evening. Good night.